Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, before we grant eyes to the surgery altar skull, we begin by examining another new weapon. Explosive Metal Hammer, a device-installed weapon used by the old hunters, crafted by the hands of the workshop heretics, the Gunpowder Warehouse. It's a giant hammer with a small furnace installed, and a blow made after cocking its firing hammer will spin out flames, causing a violent explosion at the time of missile impact. Beasts are crushed, then burned to a crisp. That straightforward offensiveness is said to be favored by hunters who despise beasts. It's a weapon with a simple yet cool premise, a hammer that makes use of explosive technology to power up its blows. And the thing about its official translation that most impresses me is the way they've managed to deliver on its theming in English. That may sound easy enough given the basic concept of the weapon, but one of the interesting things about the Japanese wording is how many terms related to firearms it uses to convey how this weapon works. By the way, I realize I'm about to employ a different complicated mechanism by activating the hidden elevator in the surgery altar, but I'm sure the visual significance of an ascension caused by putting eyes on the inside of a skull isn't lost on anyone. Instead, I want to focus on the linguistic parallel to shooting a firearm the Japanese uses when describing the boom hammer. Take the phrase gekitetsu wo okosu, for instance. Gekitetsu refers to the hammer of a gun, and while okosu has a wide variety of meanings, including to cause or to wake up, in this case it's notable as the accepted verb for moving back a gun's hammer so it's ready to fire. In the context of Bloodborne, the idea seems to be that lifting the back of the hammer to power up the next attack is analogous to cocking a firearm before pulling the trigger. And in case that phrasing wasn't clear enough, there's also the use of the word chakudan to describe the moment of impact. Since the relevant meanings of the kanji involved literally work out to something like bullet or missile arrival, the Japanese makes it plain that the explosion happens when the item being propelled forward hits its target. Once again, we're seeing the language of firearms being used to describe the action of this trick weapon. So when the official translation uses phrases like ignited and fired, as well as describing the impact of a volley of flame, I see these specific word choices as a way to get across the same idea in English. Then there's the name boom hammer, which I think not only sounds great, but also ties the weapon's theming together. It fits with the idea of a firearm because of the similarity to the colloquial term boomstick for a shotgun. It also calls back to the line about how the powder kegs have an adoration of complex design and big booms. Finally, the name works on a purely descriptive level, and the straightforwardness of the concept of a hammer that hits things and goes boom works well with the final section of the item description. Speaking of which, there's a specific word choice in this last section that helps emphasize that simplicity of purpose. The original Japanese opens its final sentence with the phrase tanteki na kougeki sei, with tanteki meaning blunt, plain, or frank, and kougeki sei meaning aggressiveness. However, since the root of the latter term comes from kougeki, which means attack, and the tan in tanteki can mean extreme, there's an air of violence to the original term that my more literal version fails to capture. The official translation of brute simplicity, though, I think succeeds in conveying the menacing nature of those terms. Combine that with all the other translation choices we've looked at so far, and you get a description of an intricately designed weapon with a menacingly simple effect. The theming couldn't be a better fit for what we know about the powder kegs. But I, for one, am curious about more than just big explosions. Is anyone in this cell?
Are you a hunter? Well, that's very odd. Do you hear the toll of the bell?
Yeah, totally. Whatever you say.
Liar. Such pettiness will be your undoing. The beast you seek will not be found here. Go back to your hunt. And if you have the chance, put this night behind you. Places better left untouched. Secrets better left alone. Only a fool would so brazenly roam.
Wait, was that last part directed at me, or?
Bear in mind, some places are better left untouched, and some secrets are better left alone. Only fools do brazenly roam.
Right, well, thanks for the warning, I guess. Before we get to the meaning of that particular message, though, I want to begin with my typical analysis of the speaker's character voice. Helpfully, there are a few things about the Japanese that jump out at me right away. First, this is someone who uses a specific form of the second person, onushi, that's somewhat archaic, at least when employed by men. The term is traditionally used to address someone of equal or lower rank, so it comes across as dated rather than rude or formal, though another noteworthy aspect of this character's speech is a consistent use of the plain form. The man also makes a good deal of exclamations meant to serve as warnings, and is quick to tell us what to do. This lends him an air of confidence that's only enhanced by the musing tone of his first few lines. The effect is somewhat similar to the phrase, "Well, well, what do we have here?" in English. There's a question being asked, but the way it's used lets listeners know that the speaker feels like they're in control of the situation. To be fair, in this case, the question reads as more genuine than that English language example, but the point is that the musing tone doesn't detract from the speaker's self-assuredness. The result of all this is that players are left with the impression that the speaker is an older man, perhaps out of a different time, who's speaking with authority and feels secure in his position. Turning to the official English then, I think the translators have done a reasonably good job of reflecting these characteristics, though without a striking term like the Japanese onushi, it's harder to tell that this is a character who employs dated speech patterns. The phrasing of "bear in mind" as opposed to "don't forget" is perhaps the part of the translation that best conveys this idea, but while I find this to be a nice touch, I don't think it works as well as the Japanese when considered as a whole. Still, the exclamations meant to serve as warnings are there, as are the commands, so the sense of the speaker being an authoritative figure comes across just fine. Now that we've established how this character speaks in general, though, let's turn back to that last warning he gave us, because these lines have their own unique feel that sets them apart from the rest of his dialogue. In Japanese, this is caused by repeating a grammatical pattern from one short phrase to another, taking the form of verb bekidenai, noun. The term beki here is normally used to indicate an action that someone should do, but in this case it's followed by the negative phrase denai, which lets us know that in fact these are actions that ought not to be taken. So this is a notably repetitive way of referencing things that shouldn't be done. Much like in the previous episode, this form suggests the speaker has slipped into a kind of mantra, and the use of ellipses both before and after the line only makes this seem more likely. Also, while the final line of the Japanese doesn't follow the same structural pattern as the preceding one, it is set off by ellipses, and since it contains a statement that only makes sense in the context of what came before, it feels like it's part of the same saying. Thankfully, this is an area where the translation does an excellent job conveying the same shift in speech style as the original. For one thing, the repetitive phrasing of "places better left untouched, secrets better left alone" does a better job recreating the feel of the Japanese than my more literal approach. That's because the structure of noun, better left in state, used by the official English closely matches the Japanese form of verb bekidenai, noun. Beyond that, though, the translators have also included an additional clue that these two lines are not ordinary speech. By rhyming alone with roam, any native English speaker who plays the game is going to notice that the feel of the dialogue has changed. Finally, as if that weren't enough, there's also the punctuation to consider. As you can see from the very first line, the translators are not averse to prioritizing English language style and not using ellipses everywhere. In this case, though, they've replicated the Japanese punctuation in order to make the mid-dialogue transition more noticeable. Nor does this clever treatment of the lines end with the first time they're uttered, since the official English introduces some slight changes to the repeated version that the Japanese does not. By doing this, the translators are able to keep their stylistic commitment to avoiding repetition, but at the same time, the words they've added to keep things fresh have been thoughtfully chosen to maintain the feeling of a repetitive set of phrases. Also, it's worth pointing out how these new versions work to emphasize the one subtle change that does get made to the Japanese. In the original, the ellipses on either side of the first part of the mantra have been removed, which is why I find it so fitting that when the official English follows suit, it makes the same statements feel more complete, as if the missing portions indicated by the ellipses had been put back in. All things considered then, I think this is a masterful way of dealing with the unusual form of these last two lines. That finally brings us back to their meaning, and here I think the translators have taken an interesting approach, because while roam does a great job of setting up the rhyme with alone, there's a bit of a trade-off happening in terms of how these lines function as a warning. The Japanese uses the word for approach, which I think does a better job of spelling out that one should not move closer, either literally or metaphorically, to the things listed in the previous line. What the word roam loses in terms of specificity, though, it arguably gains on a thematic level, because it positions the speaker as a sort of anti-Simon. One character is urging us to go deeper into the nightmare to uncover its secrets, while another encourages us to go back and leave well enough alone. Between that and the rhyme, then, I think this is a great word choice. And having said that, I think it's high time we got back to examining our arsenal. Odd-natured beast hunter curved sword, a device-installed weapon used by the old hunters. Even within its curved sword blade, an additional blade has been installed. Before transforming, it can be used to swing vertically and horizontally as a long-handled curved sword. Also, by means of transformation, its blade folds to pummel things with short combo hits. It was a device-installed weapon capable of flexible combat techniques, but eventually it was replaced by weapons such as saws that were more targeted towards beasts. As you can see, that translation is pretty straightforward, but the name of this specific version of the weapon features some interesting touches that I want to highlight. For one thing, it's worth mentioning that while the lost weapon variants have a translation that's about as obvious as it gets, that's not the case for the uncanny versions. Literally, the Japanese works out to something like different or odd-natured, and if you look up the original term in a dictionary, you'll find the word heterogeneous as a possibility as well. The idea is that there's some unusual quality to these versions of the right-hand weapons that sets them apart from the ones found in the course of the main game. But not only do terms like different, weird, or heterogeneous fail to sound good in combination with the weapon names, they also fail to get across that this difference is somehow inherent to the nature of the weapon itself. Since Uncanny neatly solves both of these problems, I think it's worth calling out as a great solution to what otherwise could have been a challenging translation choice. That brings me to the name of the base weapon, where I find myself fascinated by the decision to use the word Saif as a translation. Literally, the Japanese involved here simply works out to curved sword, with no particular allusion to the Arabic version of such a weapon known as a Saif. As a result, the English language version of this weapon is both more specific in the kind of sword it's meant to represent, and more distinctive sounding than the original, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of this decision. On the one hand, I think Beasthunter Saif sounds a lot better than Beasthunter Curved Sword. Plus it's shorter, and character limits are sure to be extra tight on right-hand weapon names, since they have longer variants. Finally, it does look similar to some of the images of Saifs I've found online, though admittedly not all of them. On the other hand, though, it's a term that I would consider obscure, and it might have cultural associations not intended by the Japanese. Plus it takes a generic weapon name and makes it sound exotic. So do all the benefits outweigh those downsides? Ultimately, I'm not sure, which is why I thought it was worth bringing up. But now that we're about to begin exploring a new area, we should discuss both the name of this new location and the dialogues of some of the people within it, like this guy.
Has someone, anyone, seen my eyes? I am afraid I've dropped them in a puddle. Everything is pale now.
Obviously, that person is in quite a state, and the name of this place actually suggests why. In the original, this is literally called the Experiment Wing, which makes it very clear that it's the place where the Healing Church experimented on people in an attempt at transcending humanity. The official English isn't quite as direct, since it uses the phrase research hall, but once you see the sort of research being done, I think that term ends up being completely appropriate. After all, it's just the sort of innocuous-sounding label an institution like the Healing Church might use for the place where they conduct these experiments. Furthermore, it ties in perfectly with information from the descriptions of items like the attire in the White Church set, which explains that the church doctors believe that medicine is not a means of treatment, but rather a method for research. So ultimately, I think the official translation of research hall works at least as well as the Japanese at conveying what sort of place this is. While we're on the subject of subtle touches though, I want to get back to the crazed lines uttered by that one patient searching through the pool, because they contain some similarly skillful translation choices. First, there's the way the translators have handled a colloquial expression for asking where something is. Literally, this would break down into something closer to, do you know where my eyeballs are? But by using a form of the expression, have you seen, the official English is able to add some vision-related irony to an otherwise innocuous expression. I also like how the phrase, I'm afraid, is made use of in the translation, I'm afraid I've dropped them in a puddle, since it's another natural way of getting across the contextual information in the Japanese that the speaker regards this act as regrettable. Finally, the treatment of the last line may look like it involves a big shift, since this place is bluish-white forever is worded very differently than everything is pale now, but the actual change in meaning is minimal. The idea is that everywhere this person tries to look to get a sense for their surroundings, the only thing they see is an endless expanse of bluish-white, which is pretty much the same thing as saying everything is pale. The official translation also has the advantage of fitting the tone of much of the NPC dialogue here, in that it sounds like potentially significant mad raving. Here's another example.
Oh, Lady Maria, save me, please. I don't hear anything.
Note that once again, our attention is being drawn to the lack of a specific sense, only this time it's hearing rather than sight. I suppose you'd lose both if your head looked like these people's, though as we'll see, sound seems to be particularly important to them. While we're on the lookout for potentially important details though, note the religious connotations present in this patient's plea. If anything, these are even stronger in the original, because the Japanese term for the Virgin Mary is Seibo Maria, with Seibo meaning Holy Mother and Maria being the word used for Mary. Add in the use of the honorific title Sama, which is reserved for use with people of a high status, and the parallel to the Catholic practice of calling out to the Virgin Mary is hard to miss. However, before I say goodbye for real, I feel I should emphasize that this is hard to capture in translation. After all, Lady Mary doesn't exactly sound great, and Bloodborne is going to put its own spin on the situation, so I think the translators have done about as good of a job as possible with the presentation. I just wanted to point out that parallel in order to keep it in mind as we go forward. Since I'm over time again though, further progress will just have to wait. In the meantime, you can expect the Translationborne index linked below to be updated within 24 hours, and as always, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, feel free to let me know. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.